Why don't you bring up the first view graph? Bring up the one after that. Okay, great. Now, most of the people in this room know what an electromagnetic pulse is, but this is being televised on YouTube, and many of the audience may not know. So I'm going to provide a brief tutorial on electromagnetic pulse. And it may seem strange, well, what are we talking about this obscure scientific issue for here? And I'll tell you why. Because not only can we lose our country, but we can lose our civilization to EMP if it is not understood. It has to be understood by not just the intelligence community and people within the Department of Defense deep state. We're a constitutional republic, and decisions are made by the people. And if the people are ignorant of the greatest threat that faces their civilization, then we will not act to protect against it. As Ambassador Cooper has known, we've known about this for decades, and yet nothing has been done. Nothing has been done to protect the electric grid and the civilian critical infrastructures upon which we all depend to survive. The EMP Commission, on which I served as Chief of Staff, calculated that if there was an EMP from the sun, or an EMP from North Korea, or EMP by sabotage using non-nuclear weapons that caused a nationwide blackout that lasted a year, which is an entirely plausible scenario, up to 90% of our population would die from starvation, disease, and societal collapse. We'd have firestorms in cities from exploding gas pipelines. We've got 100 nuclear reactors in this country that only have enough emergency generating power to run themselves and keep their nuclear reactors cool for 7 days. And after 7 days, 100 reactors would go Fukushima, spreading radioactivity everywhere. But most threateningly of all, we only have a 30-day supply of food in the whole country to feed 330 million Americans. 30 days of food at normal consumption rates. In 72 hours, the food begins to spoil because the emergency generators run out of fuel to keep the food temperature controlled and cooled. We couldn't figure out how to keep 330 million Americans alive with no food and no water, which stops immediately. You need massive amounts of electricity to keep food and water, to provide water to the cities and to keep water going. So that's the problem. Now, what is an EMP? I won't get into the physics of it. We don't have time and all the rest, but everybody in this room and everybody listening to this program has probably had the experience, I'm sure has had the experience of driving down the road, listening to your radio, and passing under a high voltage power line. And suddenly you lose the radio until you come out on the other side. What you've just experienced is the effects of electromagnetism, upsetting the electronics in your radio. The field, because the wire is insulated, so it doesn't destroy your radio, but it disrupts it temporarily. Now picture a field that's 1 billion times stronger than that, so powerful that it would destroy not just your radio, but the electronics in your car, so that your car wouldn't be able to operate. Now imagine that electromagnetic field is not just localized to that part of the highway, but it is so big that it covers all of North America. That's what North Korea can do. It can do it right now, because it doesn't need a reentry vehicle. The EMP phenomena occurs when a nuclear weapon explodes in space, but I'll get to that. Let me first talk about the first view graph. No, go back to the other one. Before we talk about the nuclear EMP, the sun can generate an EMP. And this is a picture, it's not an artist's conception, of an actual coronal mass ejection that would cause an immense EMP that would affect not just North America, but the entire world. That's called a Carrington class coronal mass ejection. That little blue dot down on the corner of the screen is the size of the Earth compared to that real satellite photograph of a Carrington class coronal mass ejection. You don't have to be an astrophysicist to understand that if that coronal mass ejection hits the Earth, traveling as it does at 1 million miles an hour or more, that it's going to ruin everybody's whole day. Next view graph. That's what you can do with the nuclear weapon, one nuclear weapon. It depends on the altitude it's detonated at. That inner ring, which is 600 kilometers in radius, okay, is from a weapon that would be detonated at an altitude of 30 kilometers. You can do that with a balloon. A meteorological balloon can get up to 30 kilometers, or a jet doing a zoom climb. If you've got a medium-range missile and you put it in a freighter off the coast of the United States, you could detonate it at maybe 300 kilometers altitude or even 400. And that would cause those outer rings, which are so big they cover basically all the electric grid in North America, taking down Canada, the United States, and a big chunk of Mexico and putting us into permanent blackout, resulting in the worst-case consequences that I described earlier. Next view graph. And saboteurs can do it. You don't need a nuclear weapon to do an EMP attack. You can do it with non-nuclear EMP weapons or radio frequency weapons, and you don't have to build them or smuggle them. You can actually buy them. This is an actual advertisement from an American magazine selling the EMP Suitcase, and it's not being sold as a weapon. The manufacturers are not being irresponsible. This is a device that's actually used for peaceful industrial purposes, because when you're building a factory or laying out an airport, and you want to know what are the electromagnetic transients that are being put out by the machinery or by the radars so that I don't cause a jet to crash or so that my machinery doesn't burn each other out, you want to use a device like this to figure out what the field strengths are. But if you were a terrorist or a criminal or a madman and you bought one of these things and you don't even need a license to buy it, and put it in the trunk of your car, the waveform, you can't see it on this view graph very well, but it generates 100,000 volts per meter, out to a few hundred yards. So put it in the trunk of your car and go visit the local transformer substation that's outside your city that's not even guarded. Usually there's just a chain link fence with maybe one strand of barbed wire. You just sit there until you see the flames coming out of the transformer. And we've arrived at a place in our high-tech society where a criminal or terrorist, a madman, one person, can plunge, can knock out the technological pillars of civilization for a major metropolitan area, all by himself. If you had a team of people like this, maybe 12 or 20, and they knocked out 20 HV transformers and knew the right ones to knock out, they could put the whole country into blackout. Now let's go to the last view graph, all the way to the end. We don't have time to go through all this. Oh, wait, stop there. Go back to that one. I talked about the threat being here and now. I don't know why the mainstream media doesn't talk about this. The MP Commission has been trying to tell us. North Korea doesn't need a reentry vehicle for its ICBMs. They've already got 2 satellites orbiting over our country called the KMS-3 and the KMS-4. That's the pattern of orbit, an example of the pattern of orbit for the KMS-3, which is one of their 2 satellites. And these satellites, we assess, might be nuclear armed. We think there's a real strong possibility they're nuclear armed for EMP attack because they look just like a secret weapon the Soviet Union devised during the Cold War to make a surprise EMP attack against the United States, wherein they disguised a nuclear weapon as a satellite and they put it on a south polar trajectory, so it approaches us from the south all the time. That's because we have no ballistic missile early warning radars facing south and no interceptors facing south. So they could get that satellite over us and detonate it before we had a chance to shoot it down. And nobody's talking about that, but that's a clear and present danger that orbits over our heads several times a day from North Korea right now. And we assess also that they don't have just ordinary nuclear weapons. As Ambassador Cooper noted in September, not only did they test a hydrogen bomb, which they described as being capable of super powerful EMP attack, but 2 days later they released a technical report called the EMP Might of Nuclear Weapons, which accurately describes what's called a super EMP weapon. This is a weapon that actually has a very low explosive yield, but it's designed to generate gamma rays, which is what makes extraordinarily powerful EMP fields, the gamma radiation. So powerful that even our best military systems are not hardened to survive it. So the argument that people use that, well, North Korea would never do that because we would retaliate and turn them to a plate of glass. Not true in the case of a super EMP weapon. We might not be able to retaliate. And one of the first things that goes is our national technical means, the satellites, their ground stations, the ballistic missile early warning radars. We depend on those things to tell us who attacked us. We would be blind and defenseless immediately afterwards. And they don't have to launch the EMP attack from their own country. They could do it off a ship. A freighter at sea. There's thousands of freighters. It could be terrorists. It could be anyone. Okay, now go forward to the last, let's go to that last view graph. Because I need to wrap this up. Let's go all the way to the end. All right. No, keep going. Keep going. There. All right. Now, beyond EMP, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, they have all conceived this new way of warfare that is not even on the radar screen of our own Department of Defense. And the EMP Commission has been trying to warn about this. We've been trying to warn about this. There are many names for this new way of warfare. The Russians call it sixth-generation warfare. The Chinese call it total information warfare. It's called many things. I call it blackout wars. Some people call it cybergeddon. But what it is, it's their idea of cyber warfare, which isn't limited to computer viruses and hacking. But it's a combined arms operation that it begins with cyber attacks, but also includes physical sabotage. It includes non-nuclear EMP weapons like the radio frequency weapon I showed you, that briefcase. And the ultimate cyber weapon in their doctrine is nuclear EMP attack. Nuclear. They don't consider that a nuclear attack because the pulse doesn't harm people directly. The pulse passes harmlessly through your bodies and then destroys electronics. Now, the indirect consequences of the pulse are far worse than blasting a city. But it's part of their cyber warfare or total information warfare doctrine. And the idea is to attack the technological Achilles heel of our society, to attack our electric grid, to black out the electric grid, which causes the collapse of all the critical infrastructures that sustain not just the lives of our civilian population, but also our military power. And on this graph, it shows the order in which these things happen. Usually in their doctrine, it would start with a natural phenomenon like a hurricane or a heat wave that would put natural stress on the grid. The whole idea is to take down the grid. And then all the rest of this, any one of those attacks could by itself collapse the grid. The dynamic, the synergism of combining these four different avenues of attack against the grid guarantees, a catastrophic outcome. And notice the time scale below is 24 hours. 24 hours. Winning this new way of warfare and defeating your adversary in 24 hours. And it's actually replacing one civilization with another in 24 hours by means of EMP. The Russians, Chinese, the North Koreans, it's all really based on the Russians' work. There's a General Vladimir Slipchenko who wrote a book called No Contact War. And all of their doctrine really copies Slipchenko. Even the Iranian doctrine on this actually praises Slipchenko on page 1 of their doctrine. This new way of war is a way of replacing one civilization with another and not necessarily occupying our territory. A lot of Americans have this misconception that what they want is our wealth because we ourselves are such a material society. Surely they want our wealth. I mean, if you look at the way historically these nations, every nation has its own strategic culture that's a product of its history. And totalitarian states and authoritarian states, their strategic culture tends to one of annihilating your enemies. Annihilating your enemies. You don't want your enemies having a chance to come back. It's better to just wipe the slate clean. So this idea that this would be done as a means of taking over the United States is a misconception. And they have different reasons for doing it. The Iranians have religious reasons, and there are geopolitical reasons for the North Koreans and the others. Now, I see us in a situation with this new way of warfare, sort of in a period, it's similar to me to the period 1937, 38, 39, before World War II broke out. And there were a handful of people like Winston Churchill and Major General J.F.C. Fuller and a small number of people surrounding him who thought that Adolf Hitler was going to launch World War II and that he had a new way of warfare called the Blitzkrieg that had never been conceived of before, where you used combined arms. You used armor and air power and mobile infantry to restore movement to the battlefield so that you could have a revolution in military affairs, all right, and defeat the armies of the Western democracies that were still thinking in terms of World War I tactics, a static battlefield. Churchill and his followers saw this threat coming, tried to warn about it, nobody listened to them. They were actually ridiculed and regarded as madmen until the gathering storm became a real storm and almost swept away the Western democracies. And the only way we turned it back was by learning how to fight a better blitzkrieg on the battlefields of North Africa and on the plains of Russia, which ultimately cost the world 50 to 60 million lives in the war that was World War II. This revolution in military affairs, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, they consider it a greater revolution in military affairs than the blitzkrieg was. In fact, it's the greatest revolution in military affairs in history, and I believe they are right. I believe they are right, because this enables, for the first time in history, a failed state like North Korea that can't even feed its own people to defeat the most advanced societies on earth. In this connection, now, Eric Klein, who is a professor of classics at Oxford, it's a book worth reading with this in mind. He has written a book that I was reading for entertainment, but I didn't realize that it was going to be relevant to this talk. His book is titled 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. Klein talks about one of the two great dark ages that befell Western civilization. One of them is little known and little understood, and it happened at the end of the Bronze Age, which was 1,200 centuries before Christ, where the great agricultural civilizations had risen up, Egypt, the Hittites, the Babylonians. But then they were attacked by much lower technology, nomadic peoples, generally called the Sea People, that didn't depend upon these higher, more advanced agricultural systems. And they didn't even know what was happening to them. But basically, the barbarians of that day, burned down the crops, they cut down the olive groves, they made the highways and sea lanes too dangerous to travel, and they destroyed what we would regard as the primitive critical infrastructures of agrarian civilization of the late Bronze Age. They destroyed it. And all of the major civilizations, that's why the Hittites went down, and the Babylonians, and cuneiform writing disappeared. And 1,200 years before Christ, a new dark ages began that lasted several centuries. Only the Egyptians came through. And they were much diminished. They weren't the superpower that they had been. They were much diminished, went into decline, and didn't come back for centuries, not until the early golden age of Greece, that we know from Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. And then mankind managed to crawl their way back to the Roman Empire, which reached an even higher technological height than those agrarian civilizations. But it was destroyed by barbarians in 476 AD, when the Visigoths and the Vandals and the like learned that by making the highways dangerous and destroying the aqueducts, they basically were able to destroy the technological infrastructure that sustained those civilizations. And Rome fell from an even greater technological height than the agrarian societies did, and it took even longer to come out of that dark ages. Most historians assess that we didn't really get back to the same level of civilization that the Romans were at the time of the 4th or 5th century BC, AD, until the Industrial Revolution, maybe the early 19th century. So it took more than 1,000 years for us to come back. Now we have reached a level of technological sophistication with our civilization that makes the Romans and the Babylonians and the Egyptians look like nothing. They were in the technological foothills. We have mounted to the Everest or the Matterhorn of technological sophistication. And Klein's point is that complexity of the civilization and its dependence on that complex infrastructure is what made them so vulnerable. So the Romans and the Egyptians and Babylonians didn't even know what was destroying them, just as we seem to be oblivious to how dependent we are on our technology and our electric grid and how important it is to protect it. And God forbid, but we have created a situation and are failing to protect the critical infrastructures that support our civilization. We have arrived at a place where the barbarians of today, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and the Russians and Chinese I would include in that, because they reject freedom and it makes them barbarians, put us at risk of toppling the technological pillars that sustain not just our freedom, but our very existence as a people. And we could go into a new, literally and figuratively, a new dark ages that would last how long? It would last how long? It might last millennia to come back if we fall again. And we must not allow that to happen. That too is what's at stake, and it's the biggest thing at stake. And it's why we must not fail. We've got a last chance here with an administration that cares about these things to not fail. And President Trump has led the way. Our our President Trump, I was so pleased, in his new national security strategy, is the first president, for the first time, that includes protecting our electric grid and other critical infrastructures from EMP attack in his new national security strategy. So that's a hugely positive thing. And Senator Ron Johnson, Republican chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, passed a bill called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act that has ordered the Department of Homeland Security to come up with a strategy to protect our society from EMP attack. That's the good news. You know, there's unfortunately more bad news. And I can fairly report this to you because I'm coming from the inside of the first year of the Trump administration. Our EMP Commission worked on this, tried to get this problem solved, and we were so hopeful. Unlike the Obama administration, we were invited many times to meet with the National Security Council staff. In 8 years, we never got to meet with the National Security Council staff in the White House even once. But the door was open for us in this White House. And I know we had an impact because of what happened with the National Security Statement, the new National Security Strategy. But our experience in working with the existing Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, the people who are supposed to implement President Trump's vision, you know, at the bureaucratic level, it is inaccurate to describe where we are today as being the Trump administration. We have elected President Trump, but it is the Obama administration that's still running the country. These people are going in just the opposite direction, and I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen it with my own eyes. One example is the termination of the EMP Commission. That was done by an Obama holdover in the Department of Defense, you know, who made false accusations against the commission, and a naive Republican staffer. They found a Republican staffer who would support them, and it resulted in the termination of the EMP Commission in September of last year, the very same month that North Korea successfully tested a hydrogen bomb and demonstrated they can make super EMP weapons. Does it make sense to terminate the commission then? No. And even worse, these same people were persuaded by Obama holdovers to establish a new EMP commission. Half of the members of the new EMP commission will be appointed by Democrats. What do you think they're going to say about the EMP threat? Are they going to regard it as an existential threat that they didn't during 8 years of the Obama administration? They'll do nothing about it. They'll tell people to go to sleep, and that isn't a real threat. There was an EMP task force formed by the Department of Homeland Security, a DHS EMP task force. They were so afraid that they didn't even want us to know who was on that DHS EMP task force. They hid their identities from us. They wouldn't let us brief them because they didn't want us to see their faces. They insisted on a teleconference where they could remain anonymous. I recognize the voice of one of those guys, okay? I feel like calling it out on national television because he's one of the problem children. He was an Obama problem child. And the one guy, the one office in the Department of Homeland Security, there are people in the Department of Homeland Security that care deeply about this issue and want to solve this issue. That guy didn't even know about the existence of the EMP task force. He's the one genuine EMP expert they had, and they kept him in the dark about the EMP task force. And there are other examples that you all know about from the newspapers. You know, I can talk about many inside examples, but Secretary Perry, much to his credit, recently tried to get the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to stop closing the coal-fired electric generating plants. The Obama administration wants to close all the coal-fired generating plants because of climate change, which is what they regard as the greatest threat to our national security. The EMP Commission has taken the opposite position. You know, we said, look at those coal-fired plants are the third most resilient form of electric power because they have 6 months worth of coal typically stored in an electric power plant. You know, their technology is the electronics in those things tends to be less vulnerable to EMP phenomena because it's an older kind of electronic technology in these coal-fired plants. So don't close the coal-fired plants. You know, that's what we need. It's one of the steps we would have to have a more resilient electric grid. And also the other forms of energy we use for generating electricity, like natural gas and fuel oil, they ought to be storing more of that stuff on site so we don't have just-in-time electric energy. Secretary Perry directed the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to stop closing the coal plants, to pass a regulation. And guess what they said? 1 year into the Trump administration. This just happened like 2 weeks ago. And they both basically told Secretary Perry, get lost. We're not doing it. Could it be that the reason for that is that the U.S. FERC commissioners are, to a man, former attorneys and lobbyists for the electric power industry? I think so. So that's what we've got, you know. I'm told the president is watching us, and I hope so. Okay, I guess the camera is there. President Trump, please. I'm running out of time here, so I'll try to keep it saying. President Trump, if anybody tells you that EMP is not an existential threat to our civilization, tell them you're fired, okay? President Trump, no. President Trump, if anybody tells you that we cannot, very cost effectively, we think it would only cost $2 billion. If it would only, that we can very inexpensively, using existing technology, protect the grid. And if anybody tells you, oh, we're not sure about that, we need to study the problem, out to the year 2020 and beyond, tell them you're fired. If anybody tells you, oh, President Trump, you know, we don't dare bring back Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. We don't dare bring back the revolutionary defensive technology that is much better than the national missile defense that basically is a result of Bill Clinton's decision to kill what they derided as Star Wars. Star Wars, I think, should be an honorific because it does represent, you know, a technological revolution in military affairs that would defeat this revolution in military affairs. It would defeat it. We have it within our grasp because we are still technologically superior to all of our adversaries. To defeat the billions of dollars they're investing in implementing this strategy and cancel it by deploying the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is also the morally right thing to do. You know, because Ronald Reagan didn't believe in mutual assured destruction. The American people want to be defended. They don't want to be avenged by being forced to destroy the cities of our adversaries. If anybody tells you, Mr. President, we can't build the Strategic Defense Initiative because it would threaten strategic stability. You know, we need to leave our cities vulnerable to North Korea and China and Russia. Please tell them you're fired. Well, thank you so much for hearing me out. I didn't even get I forgot to show you the telegraph key. Okay, I don't know if I'm probably completely out of time here. But, okay, I meant to show this, it slipped my mind. You know, I mentioned that I showed you the EMP from the sun. I have an 1859 telegraph key. This is what the advanced electronics looked like back in 1859. You can notice what a clunky, robust piece of equipment this is, okay? And yet, the sun in 1859 caused the greatest known solar storm to us. And it caused telegraphs like this to melt. Telegraph stations caught on fire. Telegraph wires all around the world caught on fire, and there were forest fires all over the world because the colonial powers built railroads and telegraph power stations in India and China and Africa. Just think about how crude this is compared to the electronics in your cell phone or the electronics we depend upon today. You don't have to be an EMP expert. You don't have to be a deep thinker or a sophisticated scientist to understand that if a natural EMP from the sun can destroy this and the civilization that built these things, what's going to happen to us who are now dependent on microelectronics, and we who live in an electronic civilization that's basically a 120-volt world. Our electronics operate on 120 volts or less. And with the nuclear EMP, we're talking about 200,000 volts per meter. Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry for forgetting that.